Ooh, you guys, this one is a comic book legend. Let's talk to Marv Wolfman. Tonight, we have the pleasure of speaking with true vampire royalty, Mr. Marv Wolfman. Now, Marv has been somebody who has been an influencer not only in the vampire genre, but in the comic book industry for a very long time. He's the guy who gave us DC's original Crisis on Infinite Earths. He was the creator of such characters as Nightwing and Starfire and Deathstroke, who you might be able to tell from his t-shirt. He also created characters for Marvel, such as Black Cat from the Spider-Man comics, as well as Bullseye from Daredevil and Nova. But as much of an influencer as he has been in comic books, he is extremely important to the vampire genre, because Marv, back in the day, was the editor and came on as writer of a Marvel comic book called Tomb of Dracula, and which he worked on for quite a while. And during that time, he created a little character who I think some of you may be familiar with, a character named Blade. So tonight, it is my esteemed pleasure to be able to introduce you guys to true vampire royalty, Mr. Marv Wolfman. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So just to get started, take us back to the 1960s. We've got a young Marv Wolfman who's just getting involved in the publishing industry. What was that like?
It was a tumultuous time, but we actually were not aware of what was going on. We all knew, a lot of us came into the business at the same time, someplace between 67 and 70. I did it in 67. Some took a year or two longer. One or two a little bit before me. What we didn't know was that the original writers, the classic writers from the 40s, who were now younger than I am at this particular moment, but older than all of us, obviously back then, were slowly being phased out. The business was changing, the age groups of the readership was changing. It was time for the next generation because nobody had come into the business since the 40s. A couple of the guys at EC, but those were all artists, were younger. The writers were still older, but virtually everybody who was in the business started in the 1940s. And therefore, a lot of them were retiring or going on to other businesses because comics was never their goal. It couldn't have been, there were no comics before them. So Gotcha. They wanted to write novels, or they wanted to draw advertising, or they wanted to do things of that sort, but comics were not it. So they were probably looking at something else, but at the same time, the companies were looking for replacements who would be bringing in brand new ideas.
Gotcha. And as part of the new guard, assumedly this was an industry that you wanted to get into and not just something that you sort of fell into, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I wanted to. All of my generation of comic book creators were fans.
Excellent.
We all were fans who came in. There is not a single person who was not a fan who became a writer or artist at that particular time. It, again, in the 1930s and 40s, most of the artists wanted to get into advertising art or comic strips, the newspaper comics.
Gotcha.
And the writers back then wanted to get into novels, and they wanted to do that. They were having trouble for one reason or another, and fell into comics, but that was not their goal. That was something that they fell into, and in fact inspired all of us to want to be in the business.
And when you came into the business, did you have a feeling of like, oh, you know, I have a bunch of ideas on how to sort of evolve on this medium that I've loved growing up?
I don't. I knew that I felt that I certainly had good ideas, and I didn't know that because I published fanzines and I wrote a lot of stories, so I was already getting feedback on my fanzines. And
Oh, great.
in fact, that's how I got asked. I did 3 different fanzines. One of them was a horror fanzine called Stories of Suspense. One of them was superheroes, which was called Super Adventures, and there was a comedy one on top, and then also an opinion fanzine, but that doesn't count in this. So I sent copies of my fanzines to the very few editors there were. It's not like today where there are thousands. There were a handful, and they liked the horror one certainly because I wrote all the stories. I wrote most of the stories that appeared there, and asked me if I'd contribute to House of Secrets, A House of Mystery, and those. So that came directly out of my fanzines, as opposed to my searching and finding a way to get into the business, because I wouldn't have known. I just wrote my own stuff, and I did it in fanzines.
Now, for those of our viewers who have never heard of what a fanzine is, can you give us a quick description of what that was like?
I sort of say fanzines were the internet of its day, except that it reached 100 people instead of 100 million. We printed all things on what's called a ditto press or a mimeograph or something, so it could only get a small number of copies. And it went out to everybody, who would buy them. I charged like 15 or 20 cents for mine. I never made any money on it, but that paid for my expenses. And there were young artists who wanted to get into the business or get into comics, but didn't write, so they would come and they'd work with me. I'd write it, they'd draw it. One of my fanzines, one of the stories, the suspense issues, I actually have a story by Stephen King in it before he was known, before I knew who he was, certainly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow.
It was sent to me, and I thought it was really good, and published it in Stories of Suspense. So that was also Stephen King's first sale, as far as I know.
That's fantastic. And you were just like, this King kid shows some promise.
Well, as I said, it was sent to me, and I thought it was well written. I liked it, and it fit with what I was doing, so it made sense.
That's awesome.
I didn't know that when Stephen King became famous, I did not know that was the same guy. Somebody because it's 20 years later, 25 years later, and I never thought about it again. But the person who originally sent it to me wrote to me and informed me of that. And later I spoke to Stephen, and he confirmed it.
All right, that's very cool. So let's jump forward a little bit. You start working for Marvel Comics, and Marvel has. Oh, sorry.
I started at DC.
Oh, you started at DC. Okay. And at some point you made the jump over to Marvel.
Yeah, a couple of years later. I was working as an assistant editor at DC, and DC was going through a cutback, and most of the assistants were let go because, again, books were being dropped, staff was being canceled, and certainly the assistants were the easiest to let go. I went and got a job at Warren Publishing, which did Creepy Eerie and Vampirella.
Right.
And later, while I was there, Roy Thomas asked me if I'd like to come over to Marvel. They were about to begin a lineup of black and white horror magazines pretty similar to what Warren was doing. And since I had the experience of being an editor at Warren on exactly the same type of material, he asked me to come over and do that over at Marvel. And
that makes sense. And one of the horror books that Marvel was doing was called Tomb of Dracula.
Right.
And so was that already in the works when you started at Marvel, or was that something that then came to be after you had been there for a little bit?
No, it was. I was already writing Tomb of Dracula before I made the move over to Marvel as an editor.
Oh, really?
None of my issues had come out yet, but I had written 2 or 3 by that point, and they were just about to start coming out. And so, it was just that way.
So when you got the gig writing issues for Tomb of Dracula, was that a situation where Marvel was basically like, this is what we're looking for, can you give that to us? Or was it a situation where they said, we're looking for a unique voice on this, what would you do with it?
I started with Tomb of Dracula #7, and the first 2 Tomb of Draculas were written by Jerry Conway, the second 2 by Archie Goodwin, and the third 2 by Gardner Fox. So in 7 issues, there were 4 writers, and that was crazy. Nobody was quite getting it. I don't know exactly what was going on there, but they wanted. I think they wanted a different approach. And since I had been doing the horror stuff, and I was already an editor, was going to be an editor there at that particular point, it was there, and I was asked if I'd like to work on Tomb of Dracula. I don't think they thought it was a book that was going to last for a long time, because again, it went through so many writers so quickly, but they wanted me to try to do it to, I guess, get my feet wet at Marvel. And that's what I did. I
see. That's very cool. And so, and if you could give us just a little bit of a history lesson of the time period, Tomb of Dracula was new in the fact that prior to that point, vampires were not allowed to be in comics?
Yeah, during the Comics Code, which meant about 1955, I guess, someplace around there, all the classic monster type stuff could not be used. You could do mystery stories, you could do those, but vampires weren't allowed, werewolves, any of those type of characters were not allowed at DC, at any company actually. And there was a huge fight, and I think Stan Lee wanted to be able to bring back a horror line. Not the gory stuff that EC had done, because that was still beyond what it would be acceptable, but which I love, by the way. But the code finally decided they would allow classic monsters like Dracula and the werewolf and Frankenstein and those type of things. And once we did that, they decided to do the Dracula book. And as I say, I started with issue 7 and lasted for 8 years.
8 years?
Yeah.
Wow. That is 8 years is a long time to work on any project. Was there any point in there where you suffered from, oh my God, what are these characters going to do next?
No, there was something about the Dracula book that I really loved working on, and I would have written it forever. Because I really loved it. The problem was that, again, as comics go through cycles, the horror stuff started to sell fewer copies. Also, I wanted to leave Marvel at that time, and for various reasons. So we worked out when I would be leaving, and the book would be. I would bring the story to an end, and they would start over, or they would go some other direction. But the book would end when it was my last issue. And
is that a rare thing to have happen?
Back then, yeah. Very often today, because today it's far more creator-centric than it was back then. It was character-centric back then. So they would just find another writer. In my case, Tomb of Dracula received an awful lot of notoriety. It got a lot of praise and such. And when I was leaving and Gene Colan was going to be leaving, the artist, they felt that if they were going to continue Dracula, it would be so different, they should end it with my last, and then they could begin again with a new one. Ultimately, they never did. They did a few issues of a black and white Dracula, but they never, nobody was into it in the same fashion, which is what it is. I really love working on the book, and I really had a million different ideas for it. And for most other people, it was an assignment, not something that they really wanted.
Gotcha. Well, we are certainly all the richer for your love of working on it, because in the pages of Tomb of Dracula, you introduced the character of Blade the Vampire Hunter.
Right.
Where did that character come from?
When I was at DC, I was working with a partner, and we were working on Teen Titans, a different version of it than I later did, and came up with a black superhero, and we wrote it, and it was drawn and everything. And for one reason or another, the story was never published. There were all sorts of explanations, but I wasn't there. All I know is that the story wasn't published. And one of the promises I made to myself was that the next character I created would be a black character, like Blade, like the character for Teen Titans, because I didn't think that black characters were represented at all in comics to any great degree. There were one or two, and that was about it. And I felt, coming from New York City, in a very urban environment, going to a school, and everybody who attends that high school is pretty much people who live within a few blocks of you, because that's the way it works. I went to school in Manhattan, to a school called High School of Art and Design, and it took people from all of New York, all the boroughs of New York. So it made it, you saw people of all kinds there. And so it didn't sound strange to me to use a black character, and I never understood why they didn't. So came up with Blade. It came to me literally in a second. I'm not joking. I had just gotten the Dracula assignment, and I wasn't thinking about anything, but suddenly the character came full blown. I knew exactly who he was. I knew what he looked like. I knew everything about him, and he took off.
That's amazing. That's very cool. Now, most of our viewers are probably undoubtedly familiar with Blade from the Wesley Snipes movies. That's certainly been sort of the most popular version of Blade. I just recently went back and read several Tomb of Dracula comics, including the one where you introduced Blade, and although, it's definitely the same character, clearly there has been a jump over the intervening 30 years or so from the first time that you put him in Tomb of Dracula to where he steps out on screen in the New Line film. How do you feel about the evolution of the character? And because it's a situation where you came up with Blade, you wrote Blade for a little while, and then he went into the hands of multiple different writers. And how do you feel about sort of how he's presented now?
Comics, you're working for a company that owns the characters, and you know that going in. But in the case of something like Blade, what you hope for is that, just like when I took on Teen Titans or I took on Superman, there's always new people coming in with fresh ideas, coming in with some new ideas, and that keeps everything fresh. That keeps the fans alert. It keeps them entertained a little bit more, because if it's the same thing all the time, it's old.
Sure.
I don't know if I assume the material is good. I have no idea, because only because most of the writers in comics are pretty good. And I would have to think that, like, I came in and worked on Green Lantern, and I was probably this 10th writer to work on Green Lantern at that point. Somebody else is going to come in and always take over from me. I don't own the character, so it's going to be done. But as I'm a person who has come in on other books, I fully expected and that somebody would come in after me on Blade or Dracula or something else. I'm always very thrilled when they decide, let's just cancel the book after Marv. I thought that's great. I like that. But even there, I know for a fact that at some point they'll bring the character back. That's just the way comics are, and I've always been. And you know that going into it.
Gotcha. And I think in a lot of ways that makes you different from many of the creators who I've certainly been talking to who have created in the vampire genre, in that most of them are authors who have come up with their own characters and have, complete control over what their characters did, and their characters don't have a life outside of when they're not writing them. But you created this character knowing that other people were going to be doing stuff with it. And then eventually somebody evidently came to you and said, we're making a movie about your character. What was that like?
Nobody came to me. I didn't own it, so they wouldn't come to me.
Gotcha.
I was thrilled by it. You as a writer, you want your material to have a life. You want people to be intrigued by it, to follow it, to want to follow it, and I was pleased. I had no problem with that. As creatively, no problem in the slightest.
Did you get to visit the set at all, or be there for a day of filming or anything?
No, oddly enough, the movie was filmed half a mile from where I lived. Was in Southern California. It was in a warehouse. Actually, it's not a studio. It was a warehouse where everything, they took it over and they built it. And I could have walked to it, but I was there on the day that they were filming the bloodbath sequence. That's the opening of the movie.
Right.
So I watched them do all that. And the director, I met the director, and he brought me over to Wesley. It was really interesting because a lot of reporters were there that day to report on it, the entertainment reporters. And so by the time I got there, he was probably had done 14,000 interviews and was starting to get tired. And so the director introduces, here's Marv Wolfman. Nice to meet you. Marv created Blade. Oh wow, tell me all about it. He suddenly came to life because I was not just yet another reporter about to ask him yet more character questions.
Right.
He had questions for me. I didn't have any questions for him. He wanted to know if Blade was always a black character. He had never seen it before, and he asked, and I brought a copy with me to show. And he was astonished by it because he had no idea. So he was really thrilled by that.
That is so cool. It's moments like that where I wish cell phones with video cameras in them had been a thing at the time, because it would be great to just have that, to be able to watch that moment take place.
Well, in point of fact, they wouldn't have allowed them to take photos.
Good point.
There was an official photographer, and he was the only one who could take them. And if you go on my website, you'd find a picture of me with Wesley. That was the only legal photo that could be taken, because there are specific photographers for publicity for movies, and nobody else is allowed to take a photo on set.
Gotcha. So I'm assuming you saw the movie when it came out.
Yeah. I've seen
all right. Well, that's a good sign that you enjoyed it. What was that? I mean, obviously you didn't write the movie, and but going to see that movie after it had been 30 years or something like that since you came up with the character, what was that sensation like?
Came up with the character in 1972.
Right.
The first story was published. Though I wrote it in 72, it was published early 73.
Gotcha. And I think that Blade came out in 99 or something like that. So definitely well over 30 years. Um, so what was that experience like, seeing that?
I thought the first film was absolutely on target for Blade, and when I first heard they were doing a Blade movie, my choice was Wesley too. Not that they asked me. Of the actors out there, um, I felt he was a good actor, and B, really good with action. He was a martial artist. He knew all of that stuff, and he did great work on some Spike Lee films that I had seen. So I knew who he was, and felt that he would be perfect for Blade. And when he was actually chosen, I was delighted.
That's very cool. So after you got done with Tomb of Dracula, and I believe actually even after the Blade movie came out, you then reteamed with your partner from Tomb, Gene Colan,
Right.
on a completely different Dracula comic that was, I believe, 4 issues, which I just read recently because I was fascinated to see what you guys would do. You know, full. I think that was something like 20 years after you had finished writing Tomb of Dracula. You guys got back together.
I,
What?
I, I can't keep track of time.
Excellent. I guess it's not really important, but but what was the sort of the original idea for that, for you guys getting back together to tackle the character?
That was Mike Richardson at Dark Horse. Uh,
Yeah.
he he really loved Dracula, and he wanted to see us do it again. We obviously could not do any of the stuff that we had done at Marvel. He couldn't look like that. There couldn't be anything from the Marvel run. Um, which was great because as far as I was concerned, I ended my storyline. That character meets the ending. For those who bought the different collections, they may not have read it yet. But yeah, I thought that I ended it, and therefore creating a new version of Dracula, yet another one, was fine with me.
And this was assumingly an opportunity for you to start with a blank slate and come up with a story originally completely from your own mind.
Right,
Uh,
we owned it.
exactly. Was that you and Gene sort of coming up with the idea together, or was it more of was it something like he would do a bunch of artwork you would get inspired by, or was the original idea yours, or how did that work?
Uh, it was mine. Once I was asked, I didn't come up with the idea of just asking Dark Horse to do it. Once I was asked, I came up with the storyline. It took a little while because I was being very careful not to repeat anything. It had to be a completely different approach. And fortunately, I could go back to the original novel that Dracula was based on and find things there that could inspire, and bringing him up to date in a completely different way. So um, it was a lot of fun to create a brand new version of something that I had done, because I could do all these things that I couldn't have done previously. It was a different marketplace. It was for an adult marketplace. It was a very different version of the character, very political. We got into things that I never would have done in a Comic Code approved book.
Do you feel like a lot of that was informed by sort of your own growth as a human being, your own experiences in the intervening time?
I think that's pretty clear with every writer. As you gain more knowledge about what you're doing, as you learn your craft more, as you learn how to write characters better, everything grows with you. So yeah, of course.
Gotcha. I mean, I'm afraid that was a bit of a leading question, just because now it's been 20 years since that Dracula comic was done. Anything that you feel like you would do if you were to come back to the character of Dracula in this time period?
I'm sure there is. We'll see. No, who knows?
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's cool. Could you talk to us just a little bit about sort of the process that you and Gene had as writer and artist and the way that you collaborated?
Gene and I worked what was known as the Marvel style. I would come up with a plot, and my plots are fairly detailed. Most of the people at Marvel, their plots would be 2 or 3 pages, and the artist would base it off of that. Because I had started at DC, where I only wrote full scripts, even though I had written all of Tomb of Dracula plot style as well, my plots tended to be like 10 or 11 pages, and breaking them down page by page. So I did that. I got the story, sent it to him, and he did his, as always, incredible art. Brilliant artist.
Yeah, and there's such a quality to his line work, and in the second series that you guys did, it even looked like we were looking at his raw pencils of that work, and it was just very, very inspiring, and just sort of very pure to look at in terms of artwork.
He was brilliant, and a really good person.
That's cool. So you guys obviously got along outside of work.
Yeah, because we also, then later did the Night Force for DC, another horror series, and we worked on several other projects here and there.
Gotcha. That's very cool. Okay, well, let's if we could talk just a little bit about sort of Marv Wolfman's approach to writing. A lot of the sort of what this particular series is supposed to be about is the creativity within the vampire genre. And for younger and newer writers and creators who are working with vampires to be able to look back to sort of the progenitors of the genre. What sort of advice would you give to younger writers today who are even not just necessarily starting out, but who are still very early in their artistic process?
What you do, I think you do this for anything, including horror material, superheroes, whatever, is you figure out who your characters are. You have to know what those characters are, what they're about, what they like, what they don't like, what they're after, what they're afraid of. Stories are about character. The plot is important, but it has to be about character first and foremost, because the character, nobody really remembers a fight scene in a comic book. A fight scene could go on forever, and they talk about it like it's, incredible fight scene, and it's beautifully drawn, and it's all these things, and you forget it 2 seconds later because you don't remember fight scenes, but you always remember characters. You may not remember the time Spider-Man fought, the Lizard and how they battled each other, but you remember how Peter Parker flunked out of college because you care about the characters, you care less. The plot is secondary to the characters, but of course you have to come up with some interesting plots as well, otherwise you lose on every level. I try to figure out who my characters are. I try to figure out what they're about, what's going to create the most problem for them. Our job is to hurt our characters as much as we can and watch as they get out of it. Watch as they figure out how to deal with it. Because if everything's okay, if there's no problems with these characters, if they are physically and mentally perfect, who cares? The story, it's like, who cares about the story? At that point, there's nothing of interest there. You want to see people, you want to see even monsters, the horrors of what's happening to them and how they are going to deal with them. And that way you can also learn a lot more about your character. You learn if they're very aggressive, you learn if they're cowardly, you learn all these different things by how they act to every situation. So figure out who your characters are and make sure you always that is the character and it doesn't change. We understand this character and we watch them grow, we watch them change in that direction, but we don't watch them change just to make the plot work. They come first. It's like in real life, your friend is going to be your friend even if they act stupid. It's true. That's the way it just works. And in storytelling, these characters are these characters, even when they have to do some things that are not in character. But then they have to deal with the fact that they're doing something they don't like, or that is a problem for them. And just watch them. So that's what I would tell a writer, and of course, come up with some interesting ideas to have these characters deal with.
As a bit of a follow-up question, just because this is sort of a rare opportunity to talk to someone of your stature, in a situation where you are coming into a writing situation where you are taking a story and characters that have, in your experience, can have upwards of 50 plus years of history. What exactly do you do in order to sort of jump off from all of that legacy into a new story?
What do I do? Let me give you an example. Superman's been around about 80 years now. And
yeah.
Not that long ago, it was published last year, I did a thing called Man and Superman, which goes back to his early days as Clark, coming to Metropolis and coming to a major change in his life, like all people, like all kids, who now have to go off and get a job or go to work or something like that, and they go to a different city or whatever. Clark is leaving his home. The fact that he has powers does not make him understand how one rents an apartment, because he's not to worry about that.
Right.
It doesn't. He suddenly has to worry about how is he going to pay for that apartment. He's never had to. He's lived at home. And powers do not help him deal with those circumstances, those situations. So what you do is you find, as I try to with Superman, and maybe one of my favorite stories that I've ever done, is find those parts of his background that nobody's asked any questions about. Somehow, how does he pay for his apartment? How did he get one? How does he find a job? Because all the histories of Superman that I've ever read prior to mine, he would apply to the Daily Planet. He'd be turned down and they'd be told, find a story of interest. And he writes about himself doing something. What I wanted to do was find a different approach to that, find a different way of telling that story that makes sense. That how does a young 20-year-old, having just graduated college, deal with life? Because again, in all those circumstances, their powers cannot help them. And that's what's fascinating to me. One of the things he says in the book was he loves writing. He wanted to be a writer. He always wanted to be a writer because he could make words mean something to him. And he mentions too that writing is the one thing that being Superman can't change. He's either going to be a good writer or a bad writer. And
excellent.
Superpowers can't change that. So he's got to learn. He's got to go through the same exact steps that I did as a writer, that everybody else who's a writer. He has to go through those same steps in learning how to deal with what his day is about, what he does. And it's exactly what we go through when we reach a certain age, getting that very first job, getting those very first apartments, having to deal with food. I mean, Mark Kent made it. What does he do? He can't cook. And well, he's left, but it's all these things that he's still Superman, but he doesn't know any of that stuff. Why should he? Superpowers don't make one have strange house buying abilities.
Yes,
So,
yes.
so that's how I deal with the stuff, and that's how I search it out: is find the thing that is going to keep challenging our character the most. And you want them challenged to show what they're about, how they deal with things.
That is absolutely excellent. Thank you for that. Um, so I just wanted to get back to one or two specific vampire questions here toward
Okay.
the end of the interview. Um, when you had mentioned that when you were doing Curse of Dracula, that you went back and sort of mined the original Bram Stoker's novel for different things that you wanted to use. What did you find in Stoker's Dracula that you were like, ah, that's a thread I really want to pull
Uh, it's more of a element of how Dracula deals with situations. The fact that he brings in his vampires to do work for him. Uh, that it's hard to explain really, but getting one clue as to where we are with the character is enough to make me continue it. You know, when I did Tomb of Dracula, as I said, I started with issue 7. So the character Dracula was already established to one degree or another. I took him further and I moved him a lot further, but I was essentially following what the 3 writers before me did and then elaborating on that. I now had a chance to ignore everybody else's suggestions and everybody else's ideas and take the original novel, but do it my way. So
on? Excellent.
we have my version of Dracula. Nobody else, nobody else's version. I had never seen, and I still haven't, a Dracula movie. I never saw any of the Hammer films. I haven't seen the original Bela Lugosi Dracula. I was just never interested in them.
Wow.
One of the things that you have to remember is in 1972, when I started, there was no way to see movies. There was no videotapes. There was no CD.
Sure.
So there was no way I could go back and watch the movies anyway. But as I was growing up,
Right.
I never watched a single Dracula film. Uh, so I was able to create my own version of Dracula based on what Stoker originally did, but taking it in my direction completely.
Right. And I guess that makes you an absolute rarity, because not only were you writing a Dracula story, but you were writing at a time where you were not influenced at all by Anne Rice's work, and also secondly you weren't influenced by any of the Dracula movies.
No,
That's
Anne Rice,
amazing.
she wasn't writing in 72, was she?
No, she wasn't. She didn't publish Interview until I believe it was 74, 78. So those books weren't even around yet. So you're one of the rare creators who took Dracula completely in the vacuum of just having the book as reference material.
I think that's what makes the Tomb of Dracula stuff that I did with Jane and even Curse of Dracula um, that strong, because I was able to come up with my own stuff instead of coming up with what a movie writer did. Uh, I we I based what I did on the original creator, and then I moved it off in my own direction, and that allowed me to write the stories that I wanted to write, not again what the movies did or anything like that. I've just never had any interest in those. I was not a big um, fan of vampires or werewolves, or I never saw any of that stuff. Just not of interest. I like the books. Stoker's novel is brilliant, but I'm not interested in other people's interpretations of Stoker's novel. just my own.
Gotcha. Very interesting. That's very interesting. We're kind of coming close to the end here, so I just wanted to sort of tell you this little anecdote. So I recently interviewed a friend of mine, Dax Stokes, who has done a podcast called The Vampire Historian. And one of the things that he said to me absolutely blew my mind, and it has to do with you, in the fact that he has a theorem that basically says that Dracula is the reason why we have the Marvel Cinematic Universe today. Obviously, this thesis is not mine, so I'm going to let Dax Stokes explain it to you in his own words.
Yeah, I have a lecture that I give.
Please tell us about that.
The trajectory is basically Bram Stoker writes Dracula, and then in the 70s, Marvel decided, I think it's about 1973, they wanted to do a Dracula comic series, and they brought in Marv Wolfman to take over. 4 to 6 issues in, he came up with this new character, Blade. But then, jump up to the 90s, and Blade is the first movie that Marvel Studios ever made as their own company. And it wasn't even a full Marvel Studios movie either. I think it was still made by somebody else, but Marvel Studios produced this. That was their first thing. So, that's the movie that kind of created Marvel Studios as a company, and did well enough for them to be able to keep doing things and eventually get to making the MCU now. And I mean, Marvel probably eventually would have created their own film studio, but Blade was the first thing they ever did, and Blade wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Dracula and Bram Stoker. So
that's fabulous. I'd never heard anyone give that that thesis before, so yeah. That's really fascinating. But that absolutely blew my mind, because it is an absolute chain of custody that goes directly back to your brain.
I've heard that before. Blade is certainly, and it's acknowledged even in the industry, as the thing that started the superhero trend to be big. But in point of fact, I forget which came first at this point, Blade or the Superman movie by Richard Donner.
That's true. Richard Donner's Superman did come before that. Yeah.
Donner certainly took Superman seriously. Luther may have been a little bit screwy, but he took the Superman character very realistically, made it a real love story, made it a real character story, and it did gangbusters. I think that Superman proved a lot of it. Blade showed that you could do all sorts of movies that come from comics. They don't have to be superheroes. I don't think we were in a singular sensation, a singular situation with Blade from Blade coming everything else. But I think Blade certainly was one of the inspirations that other people could say, these movies can make money, and let's try another one and see. Because the budgets, certainly the budget for Blade wasn't that high, and it did phenomenal business. And I'm not going to put down anything that I thought was so close to what we did. I thought the first movie was so much of what Gene and I did in the Tomb of Dracula book. And I really loved the first film. The other two I think are fine, but they're not. It's the first one that I love the most.
That's excellent to hear. That's fabulous.
Okay.
Okay, so I just have 5 real quick questions that I ask every guest that we will finish this out on, the final 5. So the first question is, what was your original entry point into the vampire genre?
Being asked to write Tomb of Dracula.
So had you not, I mean, you were clearly a horror fan before then. Had you not read Dracula before that time?
Oh no, I had read Dracula. oddly enough, a kid's version, because they had those things, simplified version of it when I was a kid, but then I reread it when I was given the assignment. I'm not a fan of horror movies in the slightest. I don't go to them. I never did. But I often would like the Edgar Allan Poe stories, the things of that. So I like the written horror.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool. Question number 2. What is your favorite thing to eat for breakfast?
Well, today I had oatmeal, but yesterday I had cereal. So
Gotcha. So not terribly important.
no, pancakes
Gotcha.
or any of those things.
Gotcha. Okay. Question 3. Do you have any sort of habits or superstitions when you sit down to write?
No, not in the slightest. I just sit down and hope the ideas come.
Okay. Excellent. So question number 4, if you could talk to any other person who was a author or creator in the vampire genre, what would you want to ask them or talk to them about? And who would that person be?
You know, this is going to sound just awful, but I really have no interest in talking about vampires. I wrote the story because I was assigned the book.
Right.
I loved the story. I loved writing it. I loved because it was a book that enabled me to have very strong characters at a time in comics when that didn't happen. We had really powerful ideas and a lot of things going on, but I have absolutely no interest in talking vampires. You know, anything I talk about would be somebody else's version of what it should be, and I'm just not interested because that gets in the way of my writing what I want. And it's much more important for me to not be bombarded with 100 people talking about what one should do in vampire stories or in any type of stories. I just want to do my stuff and have a personal attitude towards why I write each story, and that's all I care about.
That's excellent. That's very centered.
People will have to find me and ask me questions because I'm not interested in asking them.
Excellent. And then question number 5, you actually have already answered, and quite surprisingly, and that is, which actor do you consider to be your Dracula? And it sounds like nobody.
I never, you know, if I didn't know that Blade was being turned into a movie, I never would have had an actor in mind. I have no idea what the interpretation of the character is. For instance, is he evil looking? Is he an outwardly evil person? Because Dracula can also be charming. So you'd have one type of actor if you're going one way, you'd have a different type of actor if you're going a different way. And I actually have absolutely no ability at figuring out who should play who. I just do my stories. I tell my
Excellent
stories.
That's excellent. Well, Mr. Wolfman, thank you very much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to us. This has been absolutely fabulous. And thank you for everything that you have contributed. If people want to find you online, where can they go?
Well, I have a website, and marvwolfman.com, and that so that's one, just to find all my background stuff and everything. If they want to find me specifically, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and Marv Wolfman on both of those.
Okay, well, that's certainly very easy.
Yeah.
Mr. Wolfman, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. You take care.
You know, it's very easy for us in the 2020s to, look at the concept of a dhampir, a half vampire, half human character, and say, oh yeah, no, that's a cool thing. I like it when that gets used. But that's not something that got used until Marv Wolfman did it. I mean, you can trace the dhampir back to Romani culture and tradition, folklore, but But the Dampier was not something that people really knew about until Marv Wolfman gave us Blade. So that's, we just spoke with the guy who was kind of the origin of that in our pop culture. So, so much of what we enjoy in both our vampire pop culture and our comic book pop culture can be traced back to this man. And I'm just so happy that we got a chance to hear what it was like for him, you know, back in his salad days when he was, you know, first starting out, and being able to hear the, you know, where his creativity came from and, you know, what references he pulled from. And really the thing that amazed me so much is what references he didn't pull from. My mind was blown a couple times in there. So thank you for coming with me on this conversation with Marv Wolfman. Thank you also to my good friend Dax Stokes, who podcasts as the Vampire Historian. So he's got tons and tons of episodes, so you can go check him out. You'll have plenty to listen to. It's totally worth your time. If you want to check out Tomb of Dracula or Curse of Dracula, they're both available on Comixology, and they're both available as trade paperbacks from your favorite online retailer. And if you happen to be a writer or artist or creator of some kind who is working on your own vampire project, you're in luck. We have an entire video series on all the different aspects of vampires in stories and all sorts of things to think about when making your own vampire character or vampire-centric world. So check out any of the videos that we have that are labeled Your Vampire Project. But otherwise, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.